Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everyone. Welcome back to Puluso Ministries, and my name is Pastor Cliff, and welcome to another one of our episodes where we discuss very tough questions, and some are pretty basic questions regarding the Bible. Today, we'll be talking to one of the great professors. He comes all the way from Wheaton College in the States. I think it's in Chicago, Illinois, in the US. And his name is John Walton. Welcome, John, to Puluso Ministries, and I hope we're going to have a wonderful conversation on the conceptual world of the Hebrew Bible. Welcome, John.
Hi, Pastor Cliff. Good to be with you and to talk to you and your audience about these important things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. John, I know you and I have had a bit of a conversation away from the screen where our audience can know what we're talking about. But for the benefit of my audience, can you sort of briefly give them a bit of background as to who you are and what has inspired you to do this type of work that you do?
Sure, be happy to. So I've just completed 40 years of teaching Old Testament as my career. So it's been a long and exciting career to be involved in. Some people think the Old Testament is kind of boring. I find it really very exciting. I got into this since my college days. I was raised in the Bible. I was raised in a Christian home, and I learned the Bible well because my parents and my church taught it. And so I was always very interested in Old Testament. I'm not quite sure why I chose that over the New Testament for my area of focus. But in my college days, it suddenly occurred to me that there are some people out there who teach Old Testament. And as soon as that occurred to me, I knew exactly that was what I wanted to do with my life. And so I went on to graduate work and eventually got my PhD at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, a Jewish school. And then I went into my teaching career. And again, that was 40 years ago. So I've been at two institutions. I was at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago for 20 years, and now I've been at Wheaton, just outside of Chicago, for 20 more years. I've enjoyed teaching, I've enjoyed writing, and always excited about learning new things about the Old Testament and helping other people to discover new things about the Old Testament.
Fantastic. That sounds very good, John. And yeah, maybe just to kickstart our conversation, can you tell our audience what, we're talking about these terms, the ancient Near East, what is it all about, because we sort of use this term generally in scholarship, but what can you tell our audience about this particular place?
Sure. So I often talk about the way that the Old Testament is situated or embedded in the ancient Near East. And lots of my study is to try to understand that ancient Near Eastern background. So when we talk about the ancient Near East, we're talking about the ancient world that was primarily in the Mediterranean area and then further east in the area of Mesopotamia. So it includes cultures such as the Egyptian culture, the Aramaean culture, the Hittite culture, the Babylonian and Assyrian cultures, and several others along the way. So this is the scope geographically of the ancient Near East. In terms of chronologically, we start from the very beginning, really. Our earliest written texts, which come from the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, and then all the way through up to the Persian period, the fall of Babylon in 539. Usually, once you get to the Persian period, that's not quite the same as the ancient Near East anymore, because the Persians had a very different sort of culture. It's important, and I've studied that as well, but the ancient Near East basically stops in 539 with the fall of Babylon. So it covers basically a 2,500 year period of culture and of literature.
Okay, fantastic. That sounds very complex, but you've sort of made it easy for one to sort of follow track how this transition may have happened, particularly in the Persian period. But John, I wanna ask you, pertaining to religion. The ancient Near East, as I understand it, it would have comprised as a whole lot of people that sort of dwelled in the ancient Near East itself, and they particularly did religion. And how was this religion sort of made up in the ancient Near East? Is there such a thing as religion in the sphere of the world?
That's a great question, and it's a complicated one, but let me try to unpack it a little bit to see if we can identify some things. First of all, there's no word for religion in any of these languages, in Hebrew or Akkadian or Egyptian. There's really no word for religion. In our modern times, we tend to categorize things like religion or politics or economics or law. But even we, when we think about it for a moment, realize that all of those things overlap and are interrelated. And they didn't tend to set up those kinds of classifications in the ancient world. So religion was very much intertwined with politics. So that's one comment. Second comment is that when they talked about their beliefs in the ancient world, it's not so much a theology of elements that they believed in terms of doctrine or kind of orthodox kind of thinking. For them, religion was a practice, and largely a ritual cultic practice. So in ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, certainly they believed that the gods existed. They believed there were innumerable gods, and that they were all active, that they all were powerful, although some had more power than others, and that those gods, in their view, they believed that those gods had needs. They believed that the gods had created people because they were tired of meeting their own needs, and they basically created people as slave labor to meet their needs. That is, to feed them, to clothe them, to house them, to amuse them, to entertain them. Now, this is the world that Israel lived in, though it's not how Israel was supposed to think. So it serves as a contrast to what we find in the Hebrew Bible. But it shows that the religious practice in Babylon or Assyria, the religious practice, what we would call religious practice, is the rituals that supported that worldview that the gods had needs. In the writings that I've done, I've called that the great symbiosis. And that's because it represents a symbiotic relationship between people and the gods. The gods had needs, and the people performed rituals to meet those needs. Likewise, the people had needs, and the gods provided for them and protected them. And so this is a mutually dependent relationship, a symbiotic relationship that constituted what we would call religious practice. Again, they didn't view it as religion, they viewed it as life.
Okay.
This is just how things are. And so in that sense, what we would identify as their religion is all tied up in their ritual, all tied up in their mythological writings, all tied up in all of these different things. And really, and Israel, it's not like Israel invented religion. The Israelites likewise thought in terms of how they related to their God, but God had communicated them pretty early on that the great symbiosis was not a reflection of how he operated. So he had no needs. And therefore, when they did their rituals, they weren't meeting his needs. So they believed something different about their God. And of course, we would refer to that as a religious or theological difference.
Mhm.
But they wouldn't have thought it that way. It's just how they thought about the world and who God was and who they were. That's a start, at least, to get us a couple steps along the way.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you for that, John. You touch on something very important as you explain this whole concept of religion in the ancient Near East. You touch on the fact that there was sort of myth that was sort of going around. Did they actually think about it as myth, or are we trying to sort of read into what they actually kind of thought? And how would they have conceptualized these deities that that one had to look after and sort of provide for these gods? How did they conceptualize, and is there such a thing as a myth?
Well, as you know, Cliff, myth is a slippery term. It's a label that we use and that in modern times we think of in certain ways. When we hear myth, we often think about stories that are make-believe, that are not real, that people with sort of primitive beliefs might have believed in. And so people who really take their Bibles seriously generally object to the Bible being called myth, because if myth means something that's make-believe and fiction, well, that's not what they believe about the Bible. But this is largely a problem with the term. So let's think about this literature that we tend to classify as myth in the ancient world. Babylonian mythology or Canaanite mythology or Egyptian mythology. We have to recognize that even though we as modern people don't believe that the Babylonian or Egyptian or Canaanite gods existed, and therefore we evaluate that literature as make-believe, primitive beliefs, etc., that's certainly not what they thought about it. For them, their mythology was the deepest reality that they knew. They believed that reality far transcended history. You know, in our modern thinking, we often think of history as real. Documented history, that's real. Yeah, and we think of empirical approaches to prove that something really happened. We're reinterpreting what reality is through our own cultural grid. In the ancient world, they believed that their myths were the ultimate reality, and again, that it transcended history. They believed that reality was bigger than empirical history. And furthermore, that it was what was beyond empirical history that was the more important aspect of reality. So for instance, when the Israelites talk about the parting of the Red Sea, it's not the historical fact of that that's most important to them. It's the fact that God did it, which cannot be empirically recovered. Even if you could document historically and scientifically and everything about the parting of the Red Sea, it wouldn't get you to the most important part. The reality that God did that for them is what was most important. So for Israel also, they had a reality that transcended history, that was more important than history. Now, for Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, we call that their mythology. Our term, not theirs.
Yeah, I see.
And so, yet when you think about the role that literature filled for a Babylonian or Assyrian, think of the role that filled as portraying their deepest reality, we can easily see that the Bible, what we have in the Old Testament, served that same role for Israel. That doesn't mean I'm going to turn around and call it mythology, because the word is slippery. It doesn't communicate well. But the function and role in Israelite thinking that the Hebrew Bible played, is very much like that role that those elements played in Egyptian or Canaanite society.
Wonderful.
See, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated, but I like the fact that you're making it a little bit more accessible to how we think about these issues today and how they thought about these kind of issues. So our understanding of reality may not necessarily be how they would have understood reality, if I'm understanding correctly what you're saying.
Right. If we look at today's culture, and especially I'm talking about my own Western culture, what is it that defines the deepest reality for our modern Western culture? Well, it's basically science. Science plays that same role in society for us that myth played and that Hebrew Bible played for these ancient folks.
Okay, great.
And that way you could say science is our mythology.
Oh yeah, I got you. Yeah, yeah, John, I like how you sort of bring this out. And could you describe, because I know in the Hebrew Bible per se, or how they would have sort of conceptualized their gods in that particular time in their world. There's this term that keeps popping up concerning the divine assembly. Can you sort of explain to our audience what this term is? What is this whole concept of the divine assembly in the ancient world?
Sure. Now, of course, it comes under different names. Divine assembly is a good one, sometimes also called the divine council for people who are familiar with that, sometimes called the heavenly council. So different terminology, but it's all talking about the same thing. We have to start with the ancient world, not with Israel. We'll get to Israel in a minute.
Okay.
But in the rest of the ancient world, of course, they were polytheistic. When
okay,
we hear about,
can you backtrack perhaps for the benefit of our audience? Maybe some of them may not understand what you mean by the term polytheistic.
Yes. So by polytheism, we refer to the fact that they believed in many gods.
Okay.
And, Israel was monotheistic with one God. And that could use definition too, but we're not talking about that at the moment. Polytheism, they believed in a multitude of gods. Again, as I mentioned before, innumerable. They really didn't know how many gods there were. They believed that there were gods that had various jurisdiction. That is, there were gods connected to the sun or the moon or the storm or the grain, gods that did various things. There were gods connected to cities. There were gods connected to countries. And so these gods were involved in human life at many different levels in many different ways. Now, what we misunderstand, I believe, today, is that polytheism is not just about numbers.
Okay.
What's going on there is bigger than just the idea that there are lots of gods. It communicates the idea that they believed that the gods existed in community.
Okay.
In the ancient world, their identity was a communal, corporate identity. People didn't think of themselves individualistically like we do in the West. Lots of other cultures today don't have that same problem that the West has. But the individualism that dominates the West certainly did not exist in the ancient world. Their major identity was reflected in their place and status and role in their corporate group, in their community. So people understood their own identity in a community context. Therefore, when they thought about the gods, they also considered the gods to find their individual identities in the community. And that's what polytheism is about. It's the community of the gods and the way that they identify as a community, the way they operate as a community. Now, any community has leaders, has people who make decisions for the community, whether it's the elders or the judges or some sort of administration, the king and his administration. So there's a group that makes decisions. That's what the heavenly council is. That's what the divine assembly is. It's the group of the gods who make the decisions for the divine community, and of course, for the people that they are interacting with.
Okay.
So this is the nature of the divine council. It's the community, the group that makes these decisions for the gods, and it's the way the gods operate in community. They didn't see each of their gods as omnipotent, because there are other gods that did some things, and these gods did some things, and different gods did different things.
So
Now,
by omnipotence, you mean all powerful? Is that
all powerful? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So when we get to Israel now, we've got a problem.
Okay.
Because when God says that you should have no other gods before me, that word before does not refer to prioritizing them as more important than me. It means, the Hebrew word means, you shall have no other gods in my presence.
Okay.
He's basically saying, I work alone.
Okay, so he excludes all the other gods that they may
Yeah.
have known. Okay.
Right. Now, what's interesting is that the Israelites had trouble even imagining such a thing, because to them, the idea of a community is what gives identity. If Yahweh says, I have no community, then that's free floating. How do we think about a God like that?
Yeah.
I mean, when you've got, I teach at a college. It would be foolish for me to think that the president of our college was also the one who did all the accounting work, and who also cleaned all the buildings, and also who made all the decisions about student enrollment, and who also taught all the classes, right? One doesn't do all that. You've got a whole team of people.
Yes.
Okay. They believe that about the gods. You have a whole team of people. Gods, a whole team of gods.
Yeah.
Okay, so when Yahweh tells them, no, there are no other gods in my presence, they thought, wow, how does he get everything done? Where's his community? Who is he? Here's the main switch that happens. Yahweh says, I do not have a divine community. You are my community.
Wow.
You are my people. I do my work through you. And you are in my image to do this work alongside me. What an amazing change of perspective that offered. Now, even as he did this, now we're finally back to divine counsel. Even though that's the way that Israelite God works, we still find places in the Hebrew Bible, especially Job chapter 1 and 1 Kings chapter 22, that speak of this divine counsel. And you say, well, wait a minute, that seems contradictory. If God has made the statement that he doesn't really operate in a community of the gods, then what's going on here? Well, the Bible calls them the sons of gods.
Okay.
Okay. And they should be understood that they are not humans. They are supernatural beings, if we can call them that.
Are you referring to the time where there's this divine council where the Hasatan, the Satan, also comes in that?
Yes, in Job chapter 1.
Yeah.
Right. So they're having a divine council meeting there. But for the Hebrew Bible, these are not other gods. Okay. They have no status as gods. They have no jurisdiction as gods. But yet there is this heavenly community that Yahweh chooses to work through. They are also his servants doing his will, but they don't have the rank of gods. There are no other gods in his presence. Okay. But there are others that are doing his work. But his main community is the human beings that he has created. So we just have a couple places where this divine counsel pops up in the Hebrew Bible. It has some overlap with the divine counsel in the ancient world, but also has some very important differences.
Okay, and if I hear you correctly, John, based on what you're explaining pertaining to the divine counsel, if one looks back at Genesis chapter 1, I think the 26th verse, where he says, let us make man in our image, is he talking from a point of view of a council, or is he talking from a point of view of what maybe Christians may term as a Trinitarian mode of speaking. But we know, I don't know, from my thinking, I know that there's no such a thing as a Trinity sort of explicitly defined in the Hebrew Bible itself. What is going on there? Would I be correct to say that that's a notion of a council that has been communicated there in Genesis 1?
Yes, I would agree with that. My whole approach to interpreting the Bible is that I want to begin with understanding what the Hebrew narrator and his audience would have understood. You are absolutely correct, Cliff. They did not have any revelation or understanding of a Trinity. So when they read those plural forms, let us make in our image, okay, they were not thinking the Trinity. If they weren't thinking the Trinity, then I don't want to start there. I want to start with how they were thinking, because they are involved in an authoritative communication in their own context. Okay, now as we look at it from our perspective, and of course that comes later down the road, we might say, well, God does kind of sort of operate in community if we think of the Trinity. And we could think of it that way, but that certainly would not represent how the Israelite audience would have thought about it. What is the reality? Was it really the Trinity, or was it really divine counsel? I would say not necessarily either. It's using a form of communication that the Israelite audience understood. By doing that, it's not saying, hear this, O Israelites, there is a divine counsel. Okay? It's rather using the way that they thought about the world to communicate.
All right, fantastic. Based on what you are saying, John, it's kind of interesting because their conceptualization would have been embedded in this whole ancient Near East way of thinking about things. And now, how would they have understood creation itself? Because today there's this, going back and forth in terms of, was creation something that actually was created over many years, thousands of years or millions of years, or was it something that was created in like 6 literal days, as you have it spelled out in Genesis? What is their understanding in that particular reading of the text?
Great question, Cliff. And I've done a lot of thinking about it, a lot of writing about it. I can give just a little bit of information here, but I've done more in my book called The Lost World of Genesis 1. What we have to do is begin by trying to think in their categories, not ours. To ask their questions, not ours. To not assume that we know what they meant by a word like creation, or even a word like existence. If we think about creation very broadly as bringing something into existence, then you have to know how people think about existence before you can talk about how they think about creation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm following you. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we have to start then by saying, in the ancient world, did they think about existence the same way we do? And the answer is no, they did not. So for instance, in Egyptian literature, they referred to the sea as non-existent. They referred to the desert as non-existent. And we say, wait, how can that be? I mean, I can look at it, I can touch it, how can that be non-existent? Well, it only shows you that they have a different definition. For them, something exists when it has been ordered, when it has been given a role and a purpose and a function in an ordered system, then it exists. Now, that's just different from how we think, and therefore it's hard to wrap our brains around it, but there is sufficient evidence that that's how they thought in the ancient world. If then existence is defined by order, then to create something, that is, bring it into existence, is an ordering act, not a manufacturing act. Okay, so in our modern times, when we think about existence materially, something you can see and touch, etc., when we think materially, then creation becomes a material act. In the ancient world, if they think of existence in terms of order, then creation is an act of ordering. Now, if that is true in the ancient world, then we ask if it's true in Israel. And I can't go through all of the evidences, but I believe that it is and that I can demonstrate that it is. If that is true, that Israel is thinking about creation as an ordering process, then we can say that in Genesis 1, God is ordering the world. That means that he's dealing with that kind of order instead of material manufacture. And that would mean that therefore the days of Genesis, whatever they are, will not give us the age of the material universe, because that's not how the text is talking. Now, if God is ordering it, what's he ordering it for? After all, order has a purpose.
Yeah.
And I think that Genesis 1 tells us that as well in day 7. When God rests, we think, oh, he's relaxing, he's disengaging. And that would be wrong. In the ancient Near East, when a god rests, he doesn't rest in a bed, he rests on a throne. God's rest is equivalent to his rule. Once we understand that, then we can see that God has spent 6 days ordering this world under his authority, under his purposes. And his purposes are that he is going to dwell with people and rule over them, back to his community.
Oh, yeah.
He's going to dwell among them, and he's going to live among them and work through them and among them. On his throne, God is king. And that's what all of creation in Genesis 1 is about, ordering the world to work for people, but to also be a place of God's presence. So that gives a very different view of what creation is in Genesis 1. Maybe I could give 2 quick illustrations that could help further.
Sure. Please do that, yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I draw the distinction between building a house and making a home. Now, I don't know if you use those words differently so much in your part of the world.
Different. Yeah, I think they are different. A home and a house are 2 different things, yeah.
Right. So the house, as I'm talking about, it is the actual building, the structure. It's the electricity and the plumbing and the air conditioning and heating and the roof and the foundation. That's the house, the material structure.
Yes.
So you can build a house. But once you've built a house, that doesn't mean that it's a home. It could be empty.
Yeah.
Right. And so the house itself is one thing, but then people move into a house and they make it their home. And that's by purposing all of the rooms, setting the furniture where you want it, using the house for the things that you use it for. That also is a creative act. So you've got the house story, which is building the house, and you've got a home story, which is making the house your home. Now, in our modern Western way of thinking, we tend to think of creation as a house story, because that's what science gives us. Okay. Science is interested in a house story. But in the ancient world and in Israel, they're interested in the home story. Right. They don't really care so much about the house story. Whatever. Okay, they're interested in the home story. And certainly for the home, you kind of assume a house. But of course, it could be an apartment, it could be a tent. But at any rate, whatever. Okay, yeah. They assume something material, but more importantly, they've made it their home. And so that's one illustration to help this distinction between a house story and a home story. And I propose that Genesis 1 is a home story, and therefore it's not there to tell you how old the house is. Okay, the second illustration. So perhaps people have experience with going to a play in the city, a theater production. And so when I talk about that in our context, I talk about, so I want to drive downtown Chicago and I want to see this play that's being offered in one of the theaters. But, there's bad weather and traffic is slow and there was an accident on the road and that slowed things up. And then I couldn't find parking and I had to park far away and walk to the theater. And by the time I get there, oh no, I'm about a half hour late. So intermission comes and I poke the person next to me and I said, how did the play begin? Okay, so there's the question. How did the play begin? And the person next to me says, well, the play was written in the 1930s. And I say, no, that's not what I want to know. He said, well, the play has to begin with a script. I mean, how could it not? Okay, fine. But, and then the woman on the other side of me says, oh, I know what he wants to know. This theater was built in the 1950s. I say, no, I don't care about when the theater was built. Then the person behind me chimes in and says, okay, I've got it. The set was constructed specifically for this play. And it was built by no, I said, I really don't care about the construction of the set. It's very important. I know that you can't have the play without the script and without the theater and without the set. And then the person in front of me says, I got it. This cast was chosen by, no, I'm really not interested. The cast was a wonderful group of people, but that's not what I'm interested in. And they finally say, what happened since the curtain opened?
Yeah.
Now, here's the interesting part, and I'm sure all your listeners have picked this up, okay? All of those answers are correct answers.
Yeah, they are.
The script, the theater, the set, the cast, what happened since the curtain opened, all of them are correct answers, but they're different perspectives on that question, how did the play begin?
Yeah.
So when we go to the Bible and it's asking, how did the world begin? We can't tell them, oh, you have to talk about the script or the cast or the set or the theater.
Yeah.
We can't impose the way we would want to see it on their literature. We have to ask, what are they asking and what are they answering? Okay.
Yeah, it makes it a total change of game altogether.
Exactly. And so, again, from a science perspective in our modern world, we would be telling the theater story and the set story. Okay. Which they're fine. Those are interesting answers if that's your question. But Israel's not interested in the set or the theater. They're interested more in the cast, but they're actually interested in the story, what God has done to bring this about. So this is an example of the problems that occur when we impose our own perspectives, our own cultural desires, our own questions on an ancient text and expect it to be answering our questions.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
Wow. I think I like that, John, because you touch on it and it brings out, it changes the whole entire paradigm altogether. And this understanding now brings us closer now that you've mentioned that God is actually wanting to make these people his community of some sort.
Yes.
Now you have this whole play out of temples in the ancient world and rituals which are quite prominent in the text itself. What is the significant role of these temples and rituals, particularly with God and this community of people that he is actually creating for himself?
Okay, so of course in the ancient world we talked about the great symbiosis, the fact that people meet the needs of the gods, and the temple and the rituals are the primary way that happens. The temple is the housing for the god. It's not just a place where people gather to sing songs together and hear a sermon. Their temples are the place where their god actually lives.
Okay.
And therefore their rituals are presented at the temple in order to meet the needs of the gods. The sacrifices are his food. The libations are his drink. and they clothe the image of the god very beautifully. They're taking care of the god's needs. They're pampering the god.
So,
Okay?
so would you say in the Hebrew Bible, where you have this whole Mishkan, the tabernacle that is moving in the wilderness, and also ultimately to Solomon's temple and the second temple period time, is this what is going on in the text, where these people are coming into the text to offer sacrifices and libations to the God? Is that the God of Israel living in that particular place in time?
Yes, the Israelites agreed with their neighbors that the tabernacle and then later the temple were the actual housing where the God dwelt. But they differed because even though the Israelites brought the same sorts of sacrifices, they were told by God that this is not providing a need for him. This is not his food. This is not his drink. This does not sustain him. They are bringing their sacrifices, doing their rituals as a relationship building exercise, not as providing needs for God. And so in that sense, even though the trappings look all the same, God's dwelling in his house and they're bringing rituals, the reasons behind it are very different. And so again, then the temples and rituals are key because they establish the basis of relationship between God and people. Again, it's a different relationship because in the ancient Near East, it's the great symbiosis. In Israel, it's the covenant. And nobody else in the ancient world believed that the God had made a covenant with them as a people. That's unique to Israel. The kings believed that the God had made an agreement with them as king to make them king. But it's never the idea of God making his community. Okay, so the reason why temples become important then is both within this idea of the nature of the relationship between the gods and the people, but also it goes back to the idea of rest. I've told you that gods rest on thrones, but they also rest on thrones in temples.
Okay.
So the minute that it talks about God resting, he's resting in a temple on his throne, ruling, and that's how people are relating to him.
Okay, very interesting, John. I know there is this distinction in the ancient world where you have this strong role of the family, what many scholars would term family religion, and on the other hand, you have, particularly in the rise of the monarchy in Israel, the rise of what would call like a formal kind of religion or a state religion. Are you able to distinguish between the two, and what role did the two sort of play, or is there an sort of an interrelation between the two?
Okay, great question. Remember that we are in a polytheistic setting. That means there's loads and loads of gods. And there's some that are very important, like the patron god of the city, Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, very important gods. And then there are whole echelons of lower deities. So even down to the idea that they believed that when people died, they became sort of spirits that could do damage or could do good for the people still living.
Is it more like what we call an ancestor, that type of thing?
Yes, yes. Okay. So here the people are with a whole array of gods who need to be taken care of. But of course, they only have so much goods available to them. It's sort of like when people today have a little bit of money that they've set aside to try to contribute to God's work, a tithe. Okay, well, they only have a certain amount of money. You can't give to every organization. Yeah. You have to choose which one you're going to support, your local church or a missionary or something of that sort. So people have to make decisions what they're going to do with their resources. And it was the same thing when people were going to bring a sacrifice. That was a depletion of their resources. And they couldn't just do that endlessly for every god. So they had to decide which gods they were going to bring their rituals to. Now, this isn't a matter of which god they believed in. They believed in all of them. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's just a matter, you've got limited resources. So here's how it breaks down. The major gods, the big important gods, were taken care of by the corporate institutions, the city, the palace, the country, the big things, the king and the high priests and the major temple, they took care of that.
Are you able to provide examples of these major deities in this ancient world? I know you
sure. Again, Marduk in Babylon, Ashur, the patron god of Assyria, Ishtar was a major god, Shamash, the god Sin. That's a different word than the English word sin. Okay, but so all of those were considered major deities, and they were taken care of at the major temples. Most of the common people living in their little hovels really didn't have much to do with those gods. It wasn't because they weren't important. It's just that they really were not capable of giving at a level that would take care of those gods. So the state religion took care of the major gods by the arms of the state and the resources of the state. The family religion took care of those gods that they believed could come alongside of them and would do so and help them. They had the concept of a family god. A family god was typically a lower echelon deity who they had come to believe had taken a special interest in their family. And that's the god they gave their rituals to. Their meager resources were given to that particular god. And that god cared enough about them that he would take care of them. Again, great symbiosis is what they're working on here.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the state religion with the great gods and great resources. You've got the family religion with the family gods, and maybe even some of the ancestors mixed into that. The family gods who they are supporting with their resources. In that context, they wouldn't, a common person on the street living, in their little hut, they wouldn't think that if they had a problem that they could go to Marduk and ask Marduk for help. What would he care about somebody like them?
Yeah.
So they would go to their little family deity. It's just like, if something was wrong with the plumbing in your house, you wouldn't write to the president and say, will you take care of this?
Yeah.
You'd work locally. If there was a street needed repair, you deal with the local politicians, not with the president. Okay, so it's that idea. So that's how the religion worked. It was compartmentalized with a state religion and a family religion. Again, the state king, the priests certainly believed that these other lower echelon gods existed. And the common people believed that the larger gods existed. But the question is, who are you going to feed?
Okay.
Just like we would say, who are you going to give your tithe money to? And so they operated it in that way. Now, of course, Israel's got something very different. Again, almost inconceivably, this God has said, I'm the whole thing. I am the God of creator, the creator God. I am the God who runs the cosmos. I am the God who is your national God, the God of Israel. I am the God of the covenant, and I am the God of each family. And for Yahweh to characterize himself as the whole spectrum is him.
Okay.
Again, they could hardly fathom this. How could this be? You can see why the Israelites so easily kept falling into polytheism, because they just couldn't imagine this new system and how it could possibly work.
Wow. And John, can you sort of explain to our viewers, when would have monotheism, by monotheism I mean I believe in one God, sort of took up upon a strong root in the ancient world. So where it gets solidified, because you have this spectrum of the polytheism that is taking place. When does this whole notion of I believe in one God sort of become pervasive in the ancient world?
That is one of the most controversial issues in Old Testament studies, because it's really difficult. If we knew for sure the date of each of the biblical books, we could track it. But that's still a highly controversial issue of when these books took their final form. And that's not a question of when the ideas started circulating.
Yeah.
But writing was not the main impulse in the ancient world. And when did they take their final form? We have the testimony of the Hebrew Bible that the Israelites constantly had trouble figuring out this monotheism thing. And the general consensus is they really didn't get it all really figured out so that they understood it and operated with it until after the exile.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that the idea wasn't floating around all the way back till Moses. I'm very comfortable with the idea of floating around being sort of the desired way to think, but we know that the Israelites had trouble with it. A great book just came out.
Wow.
The Origin and Character of God by Ted Lewis.
Yeah.
See how thick it is?
Yeah, Ted Lewis is a professor at Johns Hopkins.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
And this is one of the really helpful resources to try to sort out all of this. He goes through the iconography, he goes through the literature, he goes through the terminology and everything, and puts it together in a very helpful way. But still, that doesn't mean that it can resolve the question of exactly when these issues caught on. And of course, we would imagine that at any given time, even in the post-exilic period, after Israel has come back, after the fall of Babylon, even then, you probably have a mix in terms of how people thought about these things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it works out that way in our daily lives as well, where we kind of evolve and develop with ideas that may be slightly older and new ideas that are probably have been around for some time, and they sort of get rooted as we go along.
Well, you're exactly right. And if you talk to Christians, even just Christians in America or Christians in South Africa or Christians in Hong Kong, you'd probably find a whole variety of different ways that people thought about God.
Yes.
Even within Christianity.
Yes, I think that's much influenced by our context and our culture, where we actually coming from, to actually make sense of what we're going through and how to understand these things. Well, John, thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time, and just before I let you go, I would like you to share with our audience. I know you're working behind the scene, and what you're currently working on, and what are some of the books that you've actually pushed out there, and where can they find your material to actually access it and purchase it for them to kind of delve into this resources that you have sort of worked on.
Right. Well, of course, the best way for immediate access for everybody is Amazon. And you can just call up my name. I've got about 30 books out there, and people can see what's there and what they might find useful, depending on what questions they have and what kind of information they'd like to learn. My current project is I'm doing a commentary on Daniel, and I've already written about 1,200 pages. And so it's going to be a nice fat one, which can be good and can be bad. And so that's what I'm working on right now. It'll probably still be 2 years before it comes out, but working hard on the book of Daniel.
Oh, fantastic. And any other thing that is out there that you would like our viewers to get their hands on?
Well, again, for the topic we've been talking about, the book that you mentioned, Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament, can be helpful. And particularly with the ideas of creation, the lost world of Genesis 1 and the lost world of Adam and Eve could both be helpful.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, John. That's all we have time for. And, thank you very much for taking the time to, avail yourself to have a conversation with us.
Great to be with you, Cliff. I hope your readers can think in new ways based on listening to this.
Yes, thank you to our audience, and this is all we have time for. And if you've liked this content we've been bringing you, you can subscribe onto our YouTube channel so that you can get this feed of our live material as we keep uploading it onto the channel. And thank you very much until we see you next time. Goodbye and God bless.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.